Hello, let me begin with a small confession. A large part of what we've trained students to do in language classrooms for decades, machines are now starting to do frighteningly well. If I walked into a language classroom 10 years ago and said that students would soon have access to tools that can write essays, correct pronunciation, and hold conversations in nearly flawless English or French, or Chinese for that matter, most of us would have called that science fiction. And yet here we are, and that may sound alarming, but I think it also opens an extraordinary opportunity, because when competence becomes cheap, education suddenly becomes interesting again. So today, I don't want to ask how we simply add AI to language teaching. The deeper question is what language education becomes once AI is already everywhere. What remains genuinely educational when linguistic performance itself becomes delegable? This is not just another digital innovation, it's a structural shift, a paradigm shift that invites us to move from a narrow focus on competence towards questions of Bildung, judgment, and intellectual sovereignty. Now, the scale of the transformation we're living through is difficult to grasp. The mind boggles. Even the Industrial Revolution may not be an adequate comparison. Industrialization replaced muscular labor, but the AI revolution increasingly touches intellectual labor. And for us, a species that has long defined itself through intelligence, that shift is a little bit unsettling, but it may also be potentially liberating. We've long regarded ourselves as the crown of creation or the highest intelligence, and this development is both a humiliation and a potential blessing for us. So in an ideal scenario, I think AI could liberate humanity from the biblical curse of labor by the sweat of our brow, as the Bible puts it. It might allow us to move from, to put it in Latin terms, from negotium to otium, from labor to education or cultivation, much like the Roman patricians who enjoyed a life oriented towards freedom and a kind of Humboldtian education avant la lettre, if you like. However, this of course would require far-reaching civilizational decisions in the political and economic spheres to be able to manage an AI-dominated future where machines create the principal share of value. Of course, such a future is not automatic. It depends on political and educational choices. Technology opens possibilities, but societies should decide what those possibilities become. So imagine a foreign language learner a few years from now. A teenager joins a language class through immersive virtual reality, puts on these goggles. The AI teacher appears in a meaningful context. The learners in experiencing the harsh German winter, but using his glasses, he's transported to France in the summer. So it's a living environment, not a classroom. There's no social anxiety. There's no fear of judgment. The interaction with the teacher feels safe. It's immediate. There's immediate feedback, which is constructive, and the whole situation is endlessly adaptable. The learner hears an improved version of their own pronunciation, adjusts naturally, and progresses far more quickly than in a normal classroom. The system senses frustration or boredom and adapts without drama. So the key point is this: everyone can now have high quality individual tutoring that was once available only to a privileged few. People like the French philosopher Montaigne, who had their own preceptor that spoke Latin to them for the first 5 years of his life. But all of that now becomes technically scalable and available to everyone. Now let's take a brief look at these large language models, which have often been dismissed as stochastic parrots. That's a very clever rhetorical phrase, but actually it's intellectually limiting. These systems are built on what's called distributionalism in linguistics, so distributional patterns of language, we might say, where meaning emerges through use, through an intricate network of relationships between words across either shorter or more distant contexts. Now, the important leap here came with transformer architectures and self-attention, where models can dynamically evaluate which parts of context matter, even across very large distances. So at scale, this produces behavior that feels less like simple prediction and more like flexible reasoning and natural use of language. The AI sort of knows more about language than we do. So whether we call that understanding is a philosophical debate. Functionally, though, it's the same thing, and pedagogically, the practical consequences are undeniable. I'd have to add that the newest generation of AI is no longer purely linguistic. Language, image, sound, and increasingly action, they all exist within a shared representational space. So models don't simply translate images into words, they process visual information directly and relate it to language and physical behavior. And that creates a shift towards what researchers might call world models, systems that simulate causal structures of reality. Intentionality, though, human intentions, they're still simulated rather than lived, of course, but the gap between linguistic output and world reference is narrowing rapidly, and education needs to catch up with that reality. So if we look at the evidence, one conclusion is difficult to avoid. AI-supported learning is extraordinarily efficient. To date, AI applications have been used in a number of areas, such as writing, DeepL Write, for instance, assessments of text and text difficulty, the simplification of reading texts or informational texts, the use of chatbots and conversational agents for speaking practice, automatic speech recognition for pronunciation training, and we have these intelligent tutorial systems that individualize learning through providing feedback on learners' progress and behavior, which meets the criteria of formative assessment as described by Dylan Williams, for instance, and John Hattie. This kind of precise feedback is something that human teachers in large classes simply can't achieve. And a meta-analysis, an analysis of a large number of studies, actually shows that AI-supported individualized systems exhibit a very high mean effect size, 1.18. So that's far above what you achieve in an average class, which would be 0.4. So there's this very high effect size between pre and post tests, and this kind of teaching, AI-based teaching, is found to be as effective as conventional teaching, at least. So now we arrive at a difficult point, perhaps the uncomfortable heart of the discussion. Because if AI can translate and interpret almost flawlessly in real time, the traditional economic argument for language learning begins to weaken. Communication itself is becoming abundant. The mere functioning of language is no longer scarce. And scarcity, of course, is the traditional economic argument in favor of acquiring a particular skill. Only skills that are in high demand and at the same time scarce are interesting to employers. So we're forced to ask a harder question. Why should people learn languages at all when machines can perform much of the practical work? So for several decades now, education has increasingly focused on measurable competencies, and that also applies to the area of language teaching, of course, with the introduction of the Common European Framework in the early 2000s and this whole OECD-driven agenda. So all of that was aligned with economic logic. But competence without wisdom is precisely the area in which machines now excel. So many of the skills that we've been optimizing for, efficient writing, standard performance, routine analysis, all of those are now becoming technical commodities within the reach of machine labor. So what remains distinctly human is not competence alone, but judgment rooted in depth of knowledge. Real judgment can't be reduced to context-limited pattern matching. So what does this mean for the language teacher? I think that when utility fades, education must return to its deeper purpose. And this brings us back to the Humboldtian idea of Bildung, the formation of the self through engagement with the world. So languages matter not because they make us employable, but because they confront us with other ways of seeing reality. And future language teaching will no longer be just about acquiring the basic competencies, because that can be done better by machines, as we've seen. It will be more about philosophy, history, a kind of bilingual or content and language integrated kind of teaching, where language learning becomes an encounter with otherness, leading to deeper understanding of foreign cultures. So what current developments appear to suggest, I think, is a new division of labour. Let machines handle the training, the initial stages of language learning, at least to a large extent, the repetitive, diagnostic, adaptive aspects of skill building, and let humans focus on education. So interpretation, cultural context, literature, history, philosophy, ethical reflection, dialogue, that sort of thing. So that teachers become guides rather than transmitters. So their role shifts towards helping learners navigate meaning, not merely producing correct output. So the goal is not to compete with machines, but to use them in a way that deepens our humanity. Alpha School in Texas, I think. I don't know if you've heard of the Alpha School. I think it's a good example, an experiment in AI-driven learning that illustrates what I mean by this. The basic idea at this school is that students spend only about 2 hours per day on core academics, so things like reading, maths, and language. And what they do is they work through highly personalized programs guided by AI systems rather than engaging in traditional classroom teaching. So the AI tracks their progress continuously, it adapts the difficulty level, and it provides rapid feedback. The adults are still in the room. The teachers are still there, they're still present, but more as guides or coaches rather than classic teachers delivering lessons. And the promise here, of course, is efficiency. Students apparently master academic content faster, and that leaves the rest of the day for projects, sports, or life skills. Of course, we'd have to think about how that sort of thinking can be adapted to 45-minute lessons at German schools, but perhaps also that will be up for discussion in the not too distant future. There is, however, real danger. Constant AI assistance can weaken our own cognitive effort, what we might call the exoskeleton trap. So that there's an exoskeleton, a cognitive exoskeleton that sort of carries us through the day. And if learners rely on support at every moment, of course, their mental muscles may atrophy. So the solution that I suggest may lie in separating phases of learning. We'll have high-tech support for acquisition for the initial stages, as I've already pointed out, followed by deliberately protected phases of independent thinking without any intervention from AI. So I'd say the trouble with education policy, the kind of education policy we're currently pursuing, is that it often focuses on tools rather than educational purpose. So we see a lot of workshops in language teaching, for example, that are about how to use a particular app, which app might be useful for a particular purpose, what devices can we use, how efficient can this be, but there's much less discussion about why we teach in the first place. So AI literacy can't simply mean knowing how to use systems. It must involve historical, conceptual, and pedagogical understanding. So the real challenge is not technical adoption, but educational framing, as I've been trying to show. Estonia offers an interesting example in this regard because it treats AI integration as a systemic cultural project rather than a technical add-on. They have professional learning communities in Estonia that bring teachers and technical experts together, and knowledge spreads through collaboration rather than isolated workshops. So the emphasis remains pedagogical. AI is used to foster deeper thinking, not dependency. And the kind of this kind of systemic approach may be more sustainable than fragmented, tool-centered implementation that we often get in teacher development here in Germany. I think Estonia may serve as a model here. So to ensure AI supports learning rather than replacing thinking, we need clear pedagogical principles. The Socratic approach that's being adopted in Estonia provides one such model. The AI guides rather than answers, and it probes reasoning. So that there's a ban on answers. The AI usually asks, how would you start? How would you go on? But never suggests a solution of its own accord, if you like. Mistakes are framed as necessary steps. The AI asks why to validate understanding. Answers are concise to prevent overwhelming pupils, and there are also cultural safeguards against the US-centric bias that's sometimes found in AI output. So instead of solving problems for students, AI should sustain dialogue and reflection and become a partner in thinking rather than just an answer machine. So let me end with a simple image. The future language teacher is not primarily a transmitter of vocabulary or grammar. The teacher becomes a guide, someone who helps learners orient themselves within knowledge. AI can take over drills and repetition in the beginning stages of the learning process, and that will free us to focus in a kind of monastic culture, so without AI, on culture, history, interpretation, literature, intellectual formation. So language teaching may move increasingly towards content-rich bilingual exploration of the world. So in the end, the goal is not to fight the machine, it is to use it in a way that makes us more fully human and to preserve intellectual sovereignty in an age of machine intelligence. Thank you for listening.